The wind howled through the ancient corridors of the palace, whispering secrets long buried beneath marble floors and gilded ceilings. In the cold hush of a candlelit chamber, a king lay dying, his breath shallow, his pulse faint. Courtiers stood still, eyes darting, as the royal physician whispered his verdict. No wound, no known illness, but something darker, quieter, had seeped into his veins. History remembers a monarch for his passion, his wars, his sweeping reforms. But history forgot to ask, who stood closest when the king began to fade? In the shadows behind the throne, a woman once adored by the crown harbored a secret that would outlive dynasties. She was no queen, no wife. She wore no crown of gold. Yet her presence was more intoxicating than power, and more lethal than betrayal. She was the king's favorite, and she was his executioner. This is the true story of how love, ambition, and vengeance converged in a royal court where no one was safe, not even the king, and how the hand that once caressed his cheek would be the same to bring his reign to an end. She was born not into nobility, but into a world that sharpened women like her into weapons. Her name was Jean Antoinette Poussin, but to France, she would become Madame de Pompadour. Though never a queen by law, she ruled the heart of King Louis XV of France with an authority no wife could rival. The rise of Jean was no accident. She was molded by salons, studied in charm, and trained in the silent strategies of seduction. Her beauty was not merely skin deep. It was calculated, deliberate, precise. In the salons of Paris, where philosophers debated revolution and artists shaped culture, Jean became more than a pretty face. She became an idea, a weaponized muse. In 1745, when she first appeared at Versailles, eyes turned not in scorn but in silent admiration. Dressed not in the gold of aristocracy, but the soft blush of understated elegance, she approached the king with the perfect mixture of deference and confidence. And from that moment, Louis XV was captivated. The king was no stranger to mistresses. The royal court was no stranger to corruption. But Madame de Pompadour was unlike any who came before her. She was not merely an ornament to be admired in quiet chambers. She was a strategist and advisor, and soon a shadow queen. Versailles, with its mirrored halls and endless feasts, was a theater of power. Each step down its marble halls was a calculated performance. Behind thick velvet curtains, alliances were born and destroyed with the stroke of a quill or the offer of a single cup of wine. Madame de Pompadour's hold on the king tightened, not through beauty alone, but through a mastery of influence. She involved herself in matters of state, advising on ministers, influencing foreign policy, and even hand-selecting members of the king's inner circle. To some, she was the savior of France's intellectual future, patron of the arts, protector of the Enlightenment. To others, she was a parasite in silk, draining the monarchy of its authority, replacing court wisdom with whispers of desire. Yet not all in court welcomed her presence. The Queen Marie Lesinska withdrew into silence and prayer. Noble families, whose daughters were once hopeful to bear the king's eye, burned with quiet fury. But none dared to oppose Madame de Pompadour openly. She held the king's ear, and in the court of Versailles, that meant she held everything. But what begins with adoration often ends with suspicion. And in the later years of Louis XV's reign, whispers began to shift. The radiant mistress who once enchanted the king began to be seen as a puppet master with her own designs. The king's health waned. His mood darkened, and his once indomitable presence seemed to shrink into melancholy. Entered Dr. Francois Quesnay, the court's physician and economist, who noted a strange pattern. The king's health, though relatively stable in public, would take sharp declines following private meals or drinks, often in the company of his inner circle, and almost always after receiving small gifts from his trusted companion. Still, Madame de Pompadour remained above suspicion. Her salons continued. Her portrait still hung in royal chambers. But beyond the chandeliers and orchestras, an invisible hand was tightening around the monarchy's throat. At the same time, political tides were turning against the king. France was suffering humiliation in the 7 Years' War. Territories were lost. Public morale was collapsing. And among the nobility, the idea began to grow. The king was no longer fit to rule. If Madame de Pompadour could elevate herself through affection, she could also secure her legacy through absence. It was during the winter of 1763 that the true unraveling began. The court had grown colder, not just in temperature, but in spirit. The king, once vibrant and bold, had become withdrawn and erratic. Servants were dismissed in secrecy. Documents disappeared from royal archives. And the kitchens, the heart of Versailles, became a place of special interest. The method was ancient, tasteless, odorless, refined through centuries of espionage and noble vendettas. Arsenic, the powder of emperors, the choice of queens, and now, the weapon of a mistress. It was never served directly. That would be too crude. Instead, it came concealed in sweets and wine, in the delicate sauces prepared by favorite chefs, chefs whose loyalty could be purchased or threatened. Slowly, over weeks, the king's strength began to fail. His skin grew pale. His appetite diminished. But the physicians, many of them hand-selected by Pompadour, found no cause. The records from this time are sparse, but letters tell the truth the court could not say aloud. A count wrote of the king's strange trembling. A duchess confided in a sister the king's sudden forgetfulness and fits of dizziness. Yet Madame de Pompadour remained serene, always at the king's side, always smiling, always present. She ensured the royal image remained strong. She hosted grand balls. She summoned painters to immortalize the king in oil and gold. But each portrait became a lie, a frozen mask to cover a decaying truth. Behind the glamour, behind the diplomacy, was the mistress's final play, and it was executed with a coldness that would make even the harshest royal executioner recoil. By April of 1764, the king was bedridden. He could no longer walk unaided. He rarely spoke. And though courtiers came to pay homage, many left in tears, not for the king's suffering, but for the dawning realization of what and who had caused it. And yet, in a cruel twist, the king outlived the woman who sought to kill him. In a poetic stroke of fate, Madame de Pompadour herself fell ill in the spring of that same year. Whether through irony or divine justice, she began to exhibit symptoms eerily similar to the ones that plagued the king: nausea, fever, confusion. Whispers in the palace grew louder. Was she poisoned in retaliation? Had the chef changed allegiance? Or had she accidentally ingested the same subtle poison meant for the monarch? Her death was swift, and though she was buried with honors, her body was denied a place in the royal crypts. The king, reportedly stricken with grief, wept at her funeral. But those closest to him would later describe the tears not as sorrow, but as fear, for she had died and he still lived. The mystery of her ambition might yet be uncovered. In the months that followed, Louis XV health began to recover. Not fully. The years had taken their toll, but noticeably. Enough that his doctors retracted earlier suspicions of terminal decline. Enough that courtiers began to look not at the king, but at his dead mistress, and wonder. And in the locked drawers of the king's study, sealed beneath wax and protected by law, letters were found. Not declarations of love, not affairs of state, but instructions, coded recipes, handwritten notes regarding dosage and delivery. signed not with name, but with a symbol Madame de Pompadour had used in private correspondences. The royal court, in its wisdom, never made these letters public. To accuse the king's favorite posthumously would bring shame not only to the throne, but to the monarchy itself. The documents were buried deeper than her name. Her legacy was recast in softer tones. The nation was told she died of tuberculosis. But history, like poison, leaves traces. In the tapestries that still hang in the Palace of Versailles, one can see her face, smiling, painted in soft pastels, draped in silk. But beneath the pigment lies a truth Versailles will never speak. She had risen farther than any mistress in French history. She had guided a king, steered a kingdom, and commanded a nation's attention. But in the end, she succumbed to the very tool she used to climb the throne: betrayal. In Part 2, the camera will turn to the aftermath, the king's final years, the public reaction, the rise of new favorites, and a long shadow Madame de Pompadour cast over France. Even in death, the stage is set. The queen without a crown has made her final move. And France, already teetering toward revolution, will never be the same. The palace mourned her, or so it claimed. Madame de Pompadour's body was scarcely cold before Versailles resumed its grand rituals. Musicians played in salons, perfumed letters arrived with gilded seals, and courtiers whispered not of grief, but of opportunity. The mistress was gone. A vacuum of influence had opened, and where power vanishes, ambition rushes in. But within the king's private chambers, the world did not resume so easily. Louis XV, once the most powerful man in Europe, stood at the center of a court he no longer controlled. Though his armies still marched and his ministers still bowed, his will had dimmed. And in the absence of Madame de Pompadour, he appeared more ghost than king, haunted not only by memory, but by the unspoken question that loomed behind every glance. Had he been loved or merely used? The royal physicians, emboldened by the king's slow recovery, began to quietly compare notes. The symptoms that had once baffled them, fatigue, vomiting, confusion, were fading, as if they had been caused not by natural decay, but by something administered, something foreign, something designed. In private circles, speculation fermented like sour wine. The cook who had prepared the king's private meals was suddenly retired. Two of Pompadour's closest attendants vanished from court. A stool was found drowned in the Seine. Officially, it was ruled suicide. Unofficially, the walls of Versailles knew better. Though no trial was ever held and no charge was ever made, the king's inner circle began an invisible purge. Servants were dismissed without cause. Accounts were erased. Portraits of Madame de Pompadour were removed from certain galleries. Some were burned, others hidden in sealed wings of the palace. And yet, her influence could not be erased so easily. For nearly 2 decades, she had shaped the very image of the French monarchy. Ministers owed her their careers. Treaties bore her signature in silence. France's greatest thinkers, Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, had benefited from her patronage. Even the palace itself had been molded by her taste, from the pastel rococo of its rooms to the art that lined its corridors. She had made herself indispensable, and that made her absence all the more haunting. Louis XV, increasingly isolated, began to retreat from the affairs of state. He entrusted more to his advisers, many of whom had been appointed under Pompadour's influence. But without her hand to guide them or control them, the French court became a theater of competing interests. One such figure was the king's next favorite, Madame du Barry. A far cry from Pompadour in style and intellect, Du Barry was a courtesan elevated not through salons and strategy, but through sheer beauty and the support of powerful backers. She lacked the political finesse of her predecessor, and her presence divided the court even more sharply. The nobles who had tolerated Pompadour's control found Du Barry's crassness intolerable. The bourgeoisie, who had once admired Pompadour's patronage of the arts, now viewed the court with contempt. And in the salons of Paris, where revolution was beginning to simmer, Madame de Pompadour was remembered not as a villain, but as the last mistress with taste, restraint, and intellect. Ironically, in death, Pompadour's legend grew. Writers painted her as a woman who dared to rule without a crown. Painters memorialized her in flowing pastels, a symbol of refined femininity. Even the revolutionaries, who would one day storm the very gates of Versailles, spoke of her with a kind of reluctant admiration. But for Louis XV, there was no such comfort. In the final years of his reign, the king descended into suspicion and apathy. He withdrew from court life. His public appearances dwindled. Even his closest allies noted a change. The once charismatic monarch had become cold, indecisive, and deeply afraid. He surrounded himself with rituals, prayers, private masses, cleansing routines, as though trying to wash away a guilt that no water could remove. Some said he feared dying as Madame de Pompadour had, suddenly, painfully, and alone. Others whispered that he feared something worse, that he had loved a traitor. France, meanwhile, began to tremble under the weight of its own contradictions. The wars had drained the treasury. The people suffered under heavy taxes, while the nobility feasted. Enlightenment thinkers challenged the divine right of kings. And though the revolution had not yet erupted, its winds were already stirring the banners of the court. Madame de Pompadour, even in death, had left behind a kingdom more fragile than she found it. Historians would later debate her true legacy. Some would call her the first modern woman in power, a master of soft diplomacy, an architect of taste. Others would argue she was the beginning of France's decline, a symbol of the monarchy's detachment from its people. But none would deny her impact. She had altered the fabric of French politics. She had outmaneuvered generals, bishops, queens. She had made herself necessary, and in doing so, she had exposed the monarchy's greatest weakness, its dependence not on law or constitution or consent, but on the affections of a single woman. And when that woman chose to turn against the crown, whether for vengeance, ambition, or survival, she brought it to its knees without lifting a sword. By 1774, Louis XV himself was dead. He did not die by poison, but by disease, smallpox. And yet, in his final moments, his eyes were said to search the room not for priests, not for heirs, but for her, the woman who had once whispered love into his ear, the woman who had fed him poison with her painted hands, the woman whose name was forbidden at court, but never forgotten, Madame de Pompadour. Her death had opened the final chapter of his life. Her shadow had lingered long after her scent had faded from the halls of Versailles. And when his body was buried, quietly, without pomp, so hated was he by the people, his legacy lay not in his policies or his wars, but in the story of the woman who had first loved him, then destroyed him. And so we return to the question that history dares not answer. What kills a king? Is it betrayal? Is it poison? Or is it love? In the end, perhaps they are one and the same, and the hand that caresses a crown may one day bring it crashing down. This is the untold tragedy of Madame de Pompadour, the mistress who shaped a kingdom and shattered a king. And though centuries have passed, the echoes of her ambition still haunt the halls of power, reminding us that behind every great throne, there may stand a darker force, cloaked in silk, smiling sweetly, waiting for the final glass to be raised. And when it is, history will once again whisper through palace walls. The king's favorite was his killer.